Landers had ruled oceans and empires with an iron hand. But one stolen glance into the defiant eyes of the stowaway hiding on his yacht left him shaken to his core. For the first time in his life, power meant nothing, because his heart had been claimed. The night was velvet and salt. The sea stretched infinite and merciless under the stars. Landers had always felt most at home here, upon the deck of his yacht, his floating kingdom, his fortress against the world. He was a man untouchable, a man who commanded fleets, whose name carried power that rivaled nations. The water was his empire, and he its sovereign ruler. Yet that night, sovereignty fractured. It began as a shadow. A strange ripple of movement near the lifeboats, where none should be. Eris moved silently, instinct sharp as the ocean wind. He was not a man accustomed to surprises aboard his vessel. Security was tight, his crew disciplined. The yacht a place where nothing slipped past his notice. But when he pulled back the tarp covering one of the lifeboats, what he found was no intruder armed with malice. It was her, a girl, no, a woman, curled within the narrow space, drenched to the bone, trembling. Her clothes clung to her like a second skin, her hair plastered to her face in dark waves. She looked fragile, her small frame shaking with cold, yet there was a defiance in her gaze that stopped him in his tracks. Her eyes lifted to his, wide, luminous, burning with something that was not fear. For the first time in his life, Landers forgot how to breathe. His heart thundered, not with fury as it should have, but with something alien, something dangerous. He should have roared, demanded answers, dragged her out and handed her to the crew. He should have been the master of the moment. Instead, he stood paralyzed, staring into eyes that seemed to see past the armor he had worn all his life. She swallowed, her lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. Only silence stretched between them, taut and electric. Eris had faced storms that could sink ships, enemies that sought to strip him of everything, yet nothing had ever undone him the way this single gaze did. He was a man carved from stone, disciplined, merciless in the boardroom and on the waves. Women had admired him, envied him, tried to capture his attention. He had never faltered, never given in. But this trembling figure in his lifeboat, staring at him as though daring him to act, she was not like anyone else, and he was ruined. She moved then, pushing herself upright, though her body swayed with weakness. "I'll leave if you want me to," she whispered, her voice hoarse from salt and fear. The sound pierced him. He could not summon anger. Instead, his throat went dry, his body taut with the sudden, maddening need to keep her there, to not let her vanish into the night. He should have demanded who she was. He should have ordered her thrown out. But all he could think was, she's here. She's real. Don't let her go. "You're drenched," he said, his voice rough, betraying none of the chaos inside him. "You'll freeze." Her brows lifted, surprise flickering across her face, but she did not look away. She held his gaze, stubborn and unyielding, as though daring him to prove himself either monster or man. And that defiance, it struck him harder than any wave. Eris extended a hand, not the command of a ruler, but the silent plea of a man unprepared for what had just happened to his heart. For a moment she hesitated. Then, with trembling fingers, she placed her hand in his. Her skin was cold, her touch feather light. Yet the instant contact sent fire through his veins, so fierce he had to force his expression into neutrality, lest she see how undone he was. He lifted her gently from the boat, as though she were something precious, something breakable, though he sensed there was steel beneath her fragility. When she stood before him, her head barely reaching his chest, he caught the faintest scent of salt and roses clinging to her, and it made his chest ache in ways he did not understand. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice lower than he intended. Her lips parted, and for a moment, he thought she might tell him. But instead, she squared her shoulders, her chin lifting in quiet rebellion. "Does it matter? It shouldn't. He was Landers, master of seas, a man who commanded answers. But for the first time, identity did not matter. What mattered was her. The fragile strength radiating from her, the way her eyes held him captive, the way his pulse hammered at a pace that frightened him. He said nothing, only studied her as though imprinting her upon his memory. And in that silence, something shifted within him. Hours later, after he had given her a cabin, after he had ordered dry clothes to be brought to her, after he had tried and failed to rationalize why he had not cast her ashore at the nearest port, Eris found himself pacing his quarters like a man possessed. Every sound made him think of her: the creak of the yacht, the sigh of the wind, the faint echo of footsteps in the hall. He had built empires, conquered markets, crushed rivals, yet he could not conquer the wild storm this one woman had stirred inside him. Her face haunted him. The trembling curve of her lips, the steel in her eyes, the fragile way her body shook even as she stood unbowed. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to unravel her secrets. But most of all, he wanted her near, always within reach, as though distance itself might rob him of breath. It terrified him, for Aris Landers did not want. He took, he commanded, he ruled, until now, sleep did not come that night. Instead, Eris stood on the deck, staring at the door behind which she rested. He had no name for her yet, but already she was carved into his soul. Who was she? This fragile, defiant stowaway who had undone him with a glance. He did not know, but he knew this. Whatever she was running from, whatever storms had driven her into his world, she was his now, and he would never be the same. She wasn't just a runaway princess, she was the first woman who had ever made him weak. The yacht glided through the open sea, its engines a low hum beneath the sound of waves. Dawn painted the horizon in streaks of gold, but inside Aris Landers' chest there was no calm sunrise, only a storm he could not contain. He had spent the night pacing, sleepless, replaying every detail of her face in his mind, the way her lashes clung wet to her cheeks, the defiance that cut through her trembling, the way her small hand had fit into his palm as though it belonged there. His heart, usually cold and impenetrable, now beat in ragged defiance of reason. She was still here, Isla. That was the name he had learned from the faint monogram stitched into her discarded scarf, Isla Vale. He had rolled it across his tongue in silence, as though tasting something forbidden, something sacred. The sound of it sent fire into his veins. Eris stood outside the cabin he had given her, his hand hovering just shy of the handle. He told himself he was only checking, ensuring the stowaway had not caused trouble, that she was safe. But the truth roared louder. He needed to see her, to confirm she was not a dream conjured by restless seas and exhaustion. The door creaked open. She was there, standing by the window, bathed in early light, her damp hair now dry, spilling in wild waves down her back. She wore a simple shirt and trousers borrowed from the crew, far too large for her slender frame, and yet she carried herself with the bearing of royalty, her chin lifted, her eyes fixed on the endless sea as though it might answer her silent prayers. When she turned and saw him, she did not flinch. Her eyes met his like steel meeting flame. "You should have left me behind," she said, her voice steady despite the shadows beneath her eyes. Eris's throat tightened. The sound of her voice. It was low, melodic, the kind that wrapped around his chest and lingered. He wanted her to keep speaking no matter the words. "Why were you hiding in my lifeboat?" he asked, though the question was more for the sake of hearing her answer than any true demand. Her jaw tightened, her gaze flicking to the horizon as though it might shield her truth. For a long moment, silence reigned. Then slowly her words spilled. "I'm running," she admitted, voice taut with strain, "from a life I did not choose, from a marriage that would have chained me to a man I could never love." Eris's hands clenched at his sides. His rival's name burned unspoken on his tongue. She was not just a girl lost at sea. She was a pawn in the political games of men like him, forced into chains of silk and gold. "You ran," he murmured, a strange ache coiling in his chest, "and ended up on my ship." Her eyes lifted to his then, wide and luminous. "Do you believe in fate, Eris Landers?" He had never believed in fate. He believed in power, in control, in carving destiny with his own hands. Yet as her gaze pierced him, he felt stripped of every conviction. For how else could he explain this, that she had fallen into his world, not by invitation, but by chance? And yet it felt as though the entire sea had conspired to deliver her to him. "I don't believe in fate," he said hoarsely, "but I believe in this." The words slipped out before he could stop them, raw and unguarded. Her brows drew together, confusion flickering across her face. "This?" He swallowed hard, unable to name it aloud. The pounding of his heart, the way her presence unraveled every thread of his control, the way his throat burned dry each time her eyes touched his. This was obsession, need, reverence, love. Words he could not yet admit, even to himself. Instead, he turned away, his hand dragging over the back of his neck as though to steady himself. But the storm within him only grew. That day blurred into a haze of motion. Eris walked the decks, gave orders, but his thoughts never strayed far from her. Each time he glimpsed her moving along the railings, hair whipping in the wind, he felt his pulse leap. She was not like the women he had known, content to smile and flatter. She moved with defiance, with quiet fire, claiming space as though the yacht itself should bend to her will. At one point, she laughed, a short bitter sound at something one of the crew muttered under his breath. The sound pierced him like lightning. He had not expected her laughter to hurt, but it did, because it was hollow, edged with wounds the world had given her. He wanted to tear down every barrier, to replace that hollow echo with something true, something bright. When the sun dipped, low, painting the sea in molten gold, he found her at the bow of the yacht, her figure silhouetted against the endless horizon. She stood tall, unbowed by the wind, her hands gripping the railing as though she were anchoring herself to freedom. He approached, silent, but she sensed him all the same. She turned, eyes fierce, hair wild around her face. "Why haven't you asked for ransom?" she demanded, her tone sharp. "That's what men like you do, isn't it? Keep what isn't yours and demand the world pay for it?" The accusation struck hard, yet it only deepened the ache in his chest. "I don't want ransom," he said, his voice steady despite the storm in him. "I want you safe." Her breath hitched, and for the briefest moment, the defiance in her gaze faltered, replaced by something softer. Vulnerability. A glimmer of trust she did not mean to show. But then it was gone, masked behind steel once more. "You don't know me," she whispered. His throat burned. "I know enough." She shook her head, her voice breaking. "No, you don't. You don't know what it means to be trapped, to have your life sold like cargo. You don't know what it means to run until you can't breathe and still feel chains around your throat." Her words lanced through him. He wanted to gather her close, shield her, promise her she would never be chained again. But he held still, fighting the urge that clawed at him, because she was not his to claim. Not yet. That night, the storm within him raged. He stood at the helm long after the crew had retired, staring at the waves that rose and fell like his restless thoughts. He had known power, wealth, enemies, but never this. The helplessness of wanting someone so completely, it burned through his every defense. She was a fugitive princess, fleeing a marriage to his rival. He should have seen her as a burden, a liability. But all he saw was the way she gripped freedom with trembling fingers, the way her courage shone through fear, the way her presence made his entire world feel alive. And he knew, with a clarity that both terrified and exhilarated him, he would protect her, no matter the cost. Not because she was royalty, not because she was leverage against his enemy, but because she was Isla, and Isla had undone him. He realized, with dread and wonder, that her nearness was undoing him faster than any enemy ever could. The days at sea stretched long and restless, the sun painting the horizon by day and the moon carving silver paths by night. The yacht was vast enough to house dozens, but to Eris Landers it felt suddenly small, suffocating almost, because Isla Vale filled every corner of it. Her presence hung in the air like salt spray, intoxicating, impossible to escape. Eris found himself watching her constantly. Not openly, he was too disciplined for that, but always with the sharp awareness of a man trained to track his enemies. Only now it was not danger he searched for, it was her. The shift of her shoulders when she stood against the wind, the way her fingers trailed absently across the railings, the shadow of exhaustion that clung to her despite her attempts to mask it. She was not like the women of his world, draped in silks and softened by luxury. Isla carried herself with an unyielding strength, even in borrowed clothes. Her eyes, wide and defiant, held a fire that no storm could extinguish, and yet, beneath it, he glimpsed the fragile tremors of a woman who had fled everything she had known, alone, into the jaws of the sea. He ached to tell her she was safe. He ached to tell her she was his, but Isla Vale was no easy captive. That morning, Aris came upon her in the dining hall, seated alone at the long oak table. She had refused the crew's chatter, declined their attempts at light-hearted talk, and instead sat with her back straight, her expression cool, as though daring anyone to disturb her solitude. Eris did not hesitate. He strode forward, his presence filling the space, and lowered himself into the chair opposite her. Her gaze flicked up, sharp and unwelcoming. "Do you make it a habit to hover over your prisoners?" "Prisoner?" His lips curved, but there was no humor in the smile. "You're not chained. You're not locked away. You're free to walk the decks, to breathe the sea air. You are no prisoner here." Her chin lifted, her mouth twisting in something that was not quite a smile. "Then why does it feel like one?" Eris's chest tightened. He leaned forward, bracing his forearms against the table. "Perhaps because you mistake protection for captivity." She met his gaze unflinching, her eyes dark with challenge. "And perhaps you mistake possession for protection." The words struck true, slicing through the thin veneer of control he wore. For a heartbeat, silence fell, heavy and charged, the hum of the yacht's engines the only sound. Possession. The word seared through him. She was right. He did want to possess her, to keep her, to claim her not as a prize of conquest, but as the one thing in this world that could quiet the storm within him. But how could he confess that? How could he name it, when even he barely understood the hunger consuming him? He forced himself to lean back, masking the fire in his chest with a veneer of calm. "You have my word, Isla Vale. No one will harm you while you're under my roof." Her lips pressed together, skeptical, but she did not argue. Instead, she returned to her meal, the clink of her spoon against the bowl filling the space between them. Eris did not leave. He sat there, watching her with a hunger that no food could sat. Later that day, Isla sought refuge on the deck. The sea wind tangled her hair into wild strands, whipping them across her face. But she seemed not to notice. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, distant, far beyond the reach of the waves. Eris found her there, as he always did. He told himself it was coincidence, that his duties simply brought him to her side. But the truth was far simpler. He could not stay away. "You'll catch cold if you stand there all day," he said, his voice low, almost carried away by the wind. She turned, and the sight of her unraveled him all over again. Her eyes, wide and luminous, shone with both fear and defiance, as though she were daring the sea itself to swallow her whole. "Better the sea than the cage I left behind," she murmured. Eris's chest constricted. "Tell me," he urged, stepping closer. "Tell me what you fled." She hesitated, her fingers curling against the railing. Then, with a breath that seemed torn from her, she spoke. "I was to be married, not for love, Not for choice, for power. My family traded me like a coin, bound me to a man who wears charm like a mask and cruelty like a crown. Her voice cracked, and though she blinked rapidly, a single tear slid down her cheek. Eris's hand itched to wipe it away, to pull her into his chest and vow that no man would ever harm her again. But he held still, his control fraying with every heartbeat. "Your groom," he said slowly, "is my rival." Her eyes snapped to his, wide with shock. "You knew?" Eris nodded once. "I knew his reputation. I did not know you were the one chained to him." Her lips trembled, her breath catching in her throat. "And now? Do you see me as leverage? A weapon to use against him?" The accusation twisted like a knife. He stepped closer, his voice rough. "No, I see you as the one thing in this world I cannot ignore." Her breath hitched, her chest rising and falling as though she were standing at the edge of a cliff, one step from falling, but then her chin lifted, her defiance returning like armor. "You don't know me, Eris Landers. You know nothing of who I am beneath the crown, beneath the chains. You see only what you want to see." Eris's jaw tightened. "Then show me," he said. "Show me who you are." For a long, searing moment they stood there, the air between them charged with something raw and unspoken. Her eyes burned into his, fierce and unyielding, and though she said nothing, the storm in her gaze told him more than words ever could. That evening, Isla disappeared. Eris's chest seized when he discovered her absence. He searched every cabin, every corridor. His voice clipped as he barked orders to the crew. Panic clawed at him, sharp and relentless, as though the sea itself had risen to steal her away. Finally, he found her at the stern of the yacht, her figure cloaked in shadows, her hands gripping the railing as she stared down at the churning waters below. His heart lurched. "Don't," he rasped, striding toward her. "Don't even think of it." She turned, startled, but her eyes held no guilt, only determination. "I wasn't going to jump." "Then what were you doing?" His voice broke, harsher than he intended. "What were you thinking standing there like that?" Her gaze softened just slightly. "I was thinking about freedom, about whether it's ever truly mine, or if it's just another illusion." Eris's breath came ragged. He closed the distance between them, his hands gripping the railing beside hers, caging her in though he did not touch her. "Freedom isn't an illusion," he said, his voice low and raw. "It's a battle. And you?" His eyes burned into hers. "You were born to fight it, not to surrender." For the first time, her expression wavered. A tremor ran through her, as though his words had struck a chord she had long buried. And in that moment, Eris knew that beneath her defiance, beneath her fire, there was a woman who longed not just to flee, but to belong. To be seen, to be chosen, not for duty, not for power, but for herself, and he would be the one to choose her, no matter the cost. Isla Vale might have fled her cage, but Eris Landers realized with a clarity that stole his breath. She was not running from chains anymore. She was running from him, and he could not, would not, let her go. The news broke like a tidal wave. It began with whispers over the yacht's encrypted radios, fragments of broadcasts caught between frequencies. Then, as the yacht neared a zone where signals strengthened, the reports became undeniable. Isla Vale's disappearance had reached the world. The daughter of a royal house, missing. Rumors of kidnapping spreading like wildfire. Cameras flashing across the globe. Anchors repeating her name with trembling urgency. And at the center of the storm, the man they called a ruthless billionaire, a pirate of the modern seas, Eris Landers. Eris stood in the yacht's command room, his shoulders squared, his jaw clenched tight as the screen flickered with images. Isla's photograph dominated every channel, her poised smile, her luminous eyes, her elegance draped in ceremonial silks. But the Isla he knew now was not the polished portrait. She was the woman who had stared down the storm with fire in her gaze, who refused to bow even when her world sought to break her. Behind him, the door opened with a soft hiss. He didn't need to turn. Her presence was immediate, filling the room with a tension that burned his lungs. You've seen it, haven't you?" Her voice was quiet, but the tremor beneath it betrayed her. "Yes." His tone was iron. She stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the screen where her fiancé's face now filled the broadcast. Declan Vale, a man of sharp suits and sharper smiles, was addressing the press. His words dripped with practiced grief. "My beloved fiancé has been stolen from me," Declan declared, voice breaking just enough to seem sincere. "I trust the authorities will bring her back safely. She is frightened, vulnerable, in the hands of a dangerous man who thinks the sea makes him untouchable." The cameras flashed, and the world seemed to bow in sympathy. Eris felt Isla stiffen beside him, her breath catching. Frightened. Vulnerable. She repeated the words like venom, her hands curled into fists. "He paints me as if I am helpless." "You're not," Eris said instantly. The words came like a vow, hard and unshaken. She turned on him, her eyes blazing. "But they'll believe him. The world will believe I'm some terrified girl clinging to your mercy." Eris's throat tightened. Mercy. If she only knew that she was the one who held power here, not him. That every moment she drew breath beside him, his will was unraveling thread by thread. "You can't control what they believe," he said, low, rough. "But I can control one thing. No harm will touch you. Not while I draw breath." Her eyes searched his, fierce yet fragile. "Why? Why risk everything for me?" "Because you are everything." The words nearly escaped him, fierce and unbidden. But he swallowed them down, forcing himself into silence. He could not confess it, not yet. Instead, he looked back at the screen where Declan continued his performance. "Because men like him don't deserve to win." Isla exhaled sharply, a sound half-bitter laugh, half-sob. She turned away, pacing, the length of the room, her skirts swaying like waves with each step. "I thought fleeing would free me," she murmured. "But the world won't let me escape him. They'll chase me until I'm dragged back into chains." Eris's chest constricted. He crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping just short of touching her. "Then let them chase. Let the world believe what it will. As long as you are here, you are untouchable." Her breath hitched, and though she did not step away, she did not lean into him either. She stood at the cusp, as though caught between flight and surrender. That night, the air was heavy with unspoken words. Isla stood alone on the deck, the sea stretching vast and endless around her. The moonlight gilded her hair, painting her in silver, making her seem otherworldly. Eris lingered in the shadows, unseen, unwilling to intrude. But the pull toward her was relentless, as though his very soul was tethered to hers. She whispered to the sea, her voice so soft it nearly drowned in the wind. "They think you stole me. But if I'm honest..." She paused, her hand brushing against the railing. "I don't know if I want to be found." The admission struck him like a blade and a balm all at once. He stepped forward then, unable to stay hidden. She startled at his approach, but did not retreat. Instead, she turned her face toward him, her eyes wide, luminous in the moonlight. "You should rest," he said softly, though what he truly meant was stay with me, where I can breathe. She shook her head, her hair catching the breeze. "I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see them. The cameras, the palace, his face." Eris's jaw clenched. He wanted to banish those shadows for her, to cut them down with his bare hands if he must. "Then let the sea keep you company," he said. "It doesn't lie. It doesn't bow. It simply is." Her lips curved faintly, though sorrow lingered in her eyes. "You speak of the sea as if it's a person." He met her gaze steadily. "Perhaps it is. It answers to no one. Much like you." Her breath caught, and for a moment, silence stretched between them, thick and humming with something neither dared to name. The next morning, the crew brought reports to Eris. More drones had been spotted shadowing their path. Not yet attacking, not yet closing in, but watching. Declan was tightening his net. Eris dismissed the crew and stood alone in the command room, his hands braced against the map spread before him. Isla was in danger. And though the thought of surrendering her was unthinkable, the weight of the world's gaze pressed down on him. If he held her here, he would be branded the villain forever. If he let her go, he would lose the only woman who had ever made his heart stumble. It was no choice at all. He would keep her. He would face the world, and he would bleed before he let anyone take her from him. That evening, Isla came to him. She entered the command room quietly, her steps soft against the polished floor. Eris straightened, the tension in his body easing just at the sight of her. "I heard them," she said. "The crew. They said he's watching us." Eris nodded once. "He'll try to corner us, but he won't succeed." Her eyes searched his, uncertain yet steady. "And if he does? What then?" "Then I fight," Eris said, his voice like stone. "I fight until there's nothing left of me." Her lips parted, as if to protest, but she stopped herself. Instead, she looked at him with something softer, something that made his chest tighten until it hurt. "Why?" she whispered again. "Why would you risk everything for me?" This time he didn't look away. This time, he let the truth hover at the edge of his words, even if he could not speak it aloud. "Because, Isla Vale," he said, his voice rough, "you're not just anyone." She held his gaze for a long, searing moment, her eyes shining with something unspoken. And though she did not reply, though no words left her lips, the silence between them roared with meaning. The world thought Eris Landers had stolen Isla Vale. But as she stood there, her breath mingling with his in the charged silence of the command room, he knew the truth with a certainty that shook him to his core. She had stolen him. The days that followed blurred into a haze of salt and sunlight, the sea their only witness. Yet for Eris Landers, time had never felt sharper. Every second etched into his chest with unbearable clarity. Because every second, Isla was near. She moved across his yacht as if she belonged to it, as if the endless horizon had been waiting for her all along. At first she had clung to silence, the walls of her guarded heart unbreached, but slowly, carefully, pieces of her began to slip through. The sound of her footsteps on the deck, the way her hair caught in the wind and brushed her cheek, the rare, fleeting moments when her eyes softened instead of blazing. It was enough to undo him. Eris had thought himself a man immune to distraction. He had built empires while storms raged around him, commanded fleets and tamed oceans. But Isla fractured his focus with a single glance. His chest burned when she entered a room. His throat dried when she looked at him too long. His pulse thundered whenever her sleeve brushed his arm, or when the faint scent of sea and sunlight clung to her as she passed. He told himself to master it, to bury it. But the truth was merciless. He had already lost. One afternoon, as the yacht carved its way through a glassy stretch of sea, Eris found her on the deck, sitting cross-legged with a book she must have borrowed from his private cabin. She wasn't reading. Her gaze drifted off into the waves, her lips moving as if caught between thought and memory. When she noticed him watching, her brow arched. "Is staring a habit of yours?" He froze, caught off guard, though he didn't look away. "Only when there's something worth staring at." Her lips parted in surprise, a faint color rising to her cheeks before she turned back to the sea. "You're shameless." But her voice lacked the bite she intended, and he held that tiny flicker of softness close, as if it were a treasure more precious than the fleets he commanded. He sat across from her, his body taut with restraint. The silence between them stretched, thick with unsaid things. "Why do you keep me here?" she asked suddenly, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. Eris inhaled slowly, steadying himself against the truth that threatened to spill. Because sending you back would be giving you to him. And that, Isla, I will never do. She turned then, her gaze sharp, but beneath it was something new, something almost fragile. You speak as if it's personal. It is. His voice was rough, stripped bare. Her eyes searched his, and for a moment, the world shrank to the space between them. That night, the sea was restless, and so was he. Eris stood at the helm, hands gripping the wheel though the autopilot held steady. His mind was consumed by her, the way she challenged him, the way she made the air itself hum when she entered a room. He thought she had retired hours ago, but when he turned, she was there. Isla stepped onto the bridge, her hair unbound, falling in wild waves over her shoulders. Her bare feet made no sound on the polished floor, but to Eris, her presence roared louder than the sea itself. You never sleep, she observed softly, her voice carrying in the stillness. Neither do you, he countered. She moved closer, her eyes catching the glow of the instruments. Sometimes I feel safe or awake, his chest constricted. No one will touch you here, he said fiercely. I know, she admitted, her gaze dropping for the briefest moment. That's what frightens me. He frowned, not understanding. She lifted her chin, meeting his eyes again, and in her gaze was a truth that stole his breath. Because safety feels dangerous, because it makes me want to trust you. Her words struck like lightning, splitting him open. His hands tightened on the wheel, every muscle in his body straining against the instinct to close the distance, to reach for her, to claim the closeness she offered. But he stayed still, his control hanging by a thread. You can, he whispered, his voice unsteady. You can trust me, for a heartbeat. She looked at him as if she believed it. Then she stepped back, retreating into shadow, leaving him trembling in her absence. The following days unraveled him further. Once, he caught her laughing with one of the crew, a soft, unguarded sound that seemed to light the entire deck. The sound cleaved him open, because it was the first time he had heard joy in her voice. He memorized it, tucked it deep into his chest, knowing he would chase it forever if he had to. Another time, she asked about the stars, pointing to constellations with childlike wonder. He answered in the low, measured tones he used in negotiations. But inside he was undone by the way her face lit with curiosity. Each moment was a thread, weaving itself into something larger, something irreversible. He told himself he could resist her, that he could stand as the immovable rock against the tide of his own desire. But each heartbeat betrayed him. Every glance at her chipped away his defenses. Every smile, every flicker of vulnerability, carved her deeper into his soul. On the fifth night, the storm came. Not of weather, but of him. Eris had retreated to his quarters, but sleep eluded him. He could hear faint music drifting from the deck above, Isla, humming a tune too soft for anyone else to notice. He pressed his hand to his chest, feeling the wild hammer of his heart. He had led men into battle without flinching, faced storms that swallowed ships whole without fear. But this woman, left him unmoored. His obsession was no longer silent. It roared within him, demanding he surrender, and yet he held fast, because she deserved freedom, not chains. Because if he touched her, even lightly, he feared he would never let go. The days stretched, heavy with tension. She moved closer now, as though testing the edges of his restraint. Once her hand brushed his when she passed him a glass of water, and the touch burned through him like fire. Another time she leaned over his shoulder to look at the maps, her breath feathering against his ear, and he nearly broke. But he did not. He would not. Because though his soul was already hers, he wanted her choice. He wanted her heart not through force, not through circumstance, but because she had seen him, the man beneath the armor, and decided he was worth it. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Isla stood at the railing, her hair whipping in the wind. Eris approached, silent, his steps slow as if nearing a sacred altar. She didn't turn, but she spoke as though she felt him there. Do you ever regret the life you built? He considered the question, his gaze fixed on the horizon. No, regret wastes time. But sometimes, his voice dropped. Sometimes I wonder what it would feel like to have something I cannot control. She turned then, her eyes locking on his, her voice barely above a whisper. Like me? The words sliced through him, stealing the air from his lungs. Yes, he breathed. For a long, pulsing moment, neither moved. The air between them throbbed with possibility, with danger, with a pull so strong it nearly shattered him. But he stayed still, rooted to the deck, his body aching with restraint. Because though every part of him wanted to close the distance, he knew she was not ready, and he would wait. He told himself he could resist her, that he could stand firm against the tide of his own desire. But as the days blurred into nights filled with silences that burned hotter than fire, he knew with every heartbeat that he was a liar. The ocean stretched endless and deceptively calm, its glassy surface gilded by the rising sun. The yacht moved smoothly across the water, its engines a steady hum beneath the gentle cry of gulls overhead. For days, peace had wrapped itself around the vessel like a fragile cocoon, but Aris Landers had lived too long in the world of power and possession to believe in peace. Calm seas were a mask, and masks, he knew, always slipped. It began with the static crackle of the radio. The crewman at the communications panel frowned, adjusting the frequency. Distortion, sir. Doesn't sound like weather interference. Aris's head snapped up from the chart table, his instincts sharpened, the familiar rush of battle readiness coiling through his veins. Patch it through. The static resolved into garbled voices, low, clipped, foreign. Not a distress call. Not routine chatter, a warning. Aris's jaw hardened. He strode onto the deck, scanning the horizon. The yacht was alone, or so it appeared. Then through the haze of sunlight he saw them. Fast boats. 3, maybe 4. Sleek black silhouettes cutting across the waves, approaching with a predator's speed. Pirates. Aris, her voice. He turned sharply to find Isla at the doorway, her hair unbound, her face pale in the light. Her eyes flicked from his expression to the horizon, where the boat surged closer. Her breath caught. What is that? Trouble, he said, his voice like steel. He moved swiftly, his presence commanding the deck. All hands alert! Secure the yacht. Get her below. The crew scattered with military precision, but Isla stood rooted, her eyes wide. No, he repeated, disbelieving. I'm not hiding below like a child, she said fiercely, though her voice trembled. If this is happening, I'm staying. A muscle ticked in his jaw. He wanted to roar at her, to command her into safety, but there was no time. The boats were close enough now that he could see the spray leaping from their hulls. Aris stepped close, towering over her, his hand gripping her arm. You will stay behind me. Do you understand? Her lips parted, and for a heartbeat her defiance wavered. Then she nodded. It would have to do. The first shot rang out. A sharp crack split the air, followed by the whine of a bullet ricocheting off the yacht's railing. Isla flinched, pressing against his side, and a surge of primal fury blazed through Aris's chest. They dared to fire at her. His voice thundered across the deck. Shields up! Man the defenses! Hidden panels along the yacht's side slid open, revealing steel plating and mounted deterrents. Aris Landers' vessel was no ordinary toy for the rich. It was a fortress dressed in luxury. The fast boats circled like sharks, engines snarling, weapons raised. Masked men shouted orders in a language Isla didn't know, but the threat was clear. They wanted to board. Aris stood tall at the helm of the deck, his presence unshakable despite the storm brewing around them. He barked orders, his crew responding with disciplined precision. Smoke canisters fired, shrouding the yacht in a gray veil. Water cannons roared, blasting at the encroaching boats, but the attackers pressed closer, reckless, hungry. Aris, Isla cried, as one of the fast boats rammed the yacht's side with a bone-jarring crash. Grappling hooks clanged against the rail. Figures vaulted aboard, masked, armed, shouting. Aris moved like a storm unleashed. His fist struck the first boarder, sending the man sprawling. Another lunged with a knife, only to meet the brutal crack of Aris's elbow. Isla's heart pounded as she clutched the railing, watching chaos erupt around her. She had seen men fight before, but not like this. Not with such cold precision, such absolute dominance. Eris was fury made flesh, every movement designed to destroy. But even as he fought, his gaze kept finding hers, checking, protecting. "Behind you," Isla shouted, her voice breaking through the roar of the fight. Eris spun just in time, catching the attacker's blade in his palm. Pain flashed across his face, but he twisted, ripping the weapon free and hurling the man into the deck with bone-crushing force. Blood welled on his hand. Isla's throat tightened, but before she could move, another figure lunged for her. She froze. The pirate's arm clamped around her waist, yanking her back, a blade flashing at her throat. "Isla!" Eris's roar split the air. For a heartbeat, she felt the cold bite of steel against her skin, the hot stench of her captor's breath. Fear clawed up her chest. Then Eris was there. He moved with terrifying speed, his injured hand seizing the man's wrist, twisting until the blade clattered to the deck. His other arm crushed around Isla, pulling her free, shielding her with his own body as he slammed the attacker to the ground. Isla gasped, clutching his shirt, her body trembling against his. She could feel the raw power of him, the way his chest heaved, the ferocity in every line of him. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough. She shook her head, breathless. His eyes burned into hers, a storm of rage and relief. For a moment, the world shrank to just the two of them, bound together by danger and the terrifying closeness of what could have been lost. The fight raged on, but with Eris at the helm, the tide turned. His crew rallied, forcing the boarders back toward the rails. One by one, the attackers fell or fled, retreating to their boats under the hail of counterfire. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The surviving raiders sped away, vanishing into the horizon, leaving the yacht battered but unbroken. Silence fell over the deck, broken only by the hiss of smoke dispersing into the wind. Isla stood pressed against Eris's chest, her hand still clinging to him, her pulse racing wildly. She could smell the salt of the sea on his skin, the faint copper tang of blood from his hand. She pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his. "You're hurt. It's nothing," he said gruffly. "It's not nothing," she whispered fiercely, taking his hand in hers. The cut was deep, angry. She guided him toward the cabin before he could protest, her touch trembling but determined. Inside, she found the first aid kit, her fingers clumsy as she tried to clean the wound. Eris watched her silently, his expression unreadable, though his gaze never left her face. "You could have been killed," she whispered, her voice breaking. His lips curved faintly without humor. "So could you." Her hand stilled, and she looked up at him, her eyes shining. You didn't think about yourself at all out there." "I never do," he said simply. His gaze burned into hers. "Especially not when it's you." The air thickened, charged with something that neither of them could name, though both could feel it searing through their veins. Isla's breath caught. Her fingers lingered on his hand, her touch softer now, almost reverent. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Eris leaned closer, his face inches from hers, his voice low and raw. "Because losing you is the only thing I fear." For a long, trembling moment, neither moved. The storm outside had passed, but inside, another raged, a dangerous, undeniable pull that neither could resist forever. Isla's pulse thundered in her ears. Her body ached with confusion, with fear, with the undeniable truth that her heart no longer knew where safety ended and danger began. And Eris felt the last of his walls crumble, the chains of his restraint shattering. She was his weakness, his undoing, his everything, and no storm, no enemy, no force on earth would ever take her from him. The sea was calm again, but calm meant nothing now. Isla knew the real storm had only just begun, the one inside her chest and inside his. Night had fallen over the sea like a velvet shroud. Stars pricked across the vast black dome of sky. The yacht glided through calm waters, its deck washed silver under the moonlight. To anyone looking from the outside, it seemed peaceful again. Too peaceful, given the violence that had battered it mere hours before. But peace had no place in Isla's chest. Not after the way she had seen Aris fight. Not after the way she had felt his body shield hers, his bloodied hand clutching her as though his life depended on it. She had thought she knew what strength looked like. She had seen generals, bodyguards, rulers, but Aris Landers was something else entirely, not because of the way he fought with ruthless precision, but because even as danger roared around him, his every movement had been for her. Every strike, every breath, every ounce of fury, directed not toward victory, but toward keeping her safe. And that knowledge weighed on her, pressing against the walls she had so carefully built. Aris stood alone at the bow of the yacht, his broad figure a dark silhouette against the restless glitter of the sea. He hadn't spoken much since the attack, his silence more eloquent than words. Isla hesitated in the doorway of the cabin, watching him. His shoulders were tense, his posture rigid, as though he carried the whole ocean on his back. His injured hand was bandaged clumsily where she had dressed it, yet still he stood there, unflinching, staring out into the endless horizon. Her heart thudded unevenly. She should have left him to his silence. But something pulled her forward, something stronger than sense, stronger than fear. She stepped onto the deck, the cool boards creaking under her bare feet. The sea air wrapped around her, carrying the faint salt scent of him. "You haven't rested," she said softly. He didn't turn. For a long moment she thought he might ignore her, but then his voice, low and rough, cut through the night. "Neither have you." She moved closer, her arms wrapping around herself. "How could I? After today?" He turned then, finally, and the sight of his face in the moonlight made her breath falter. His eyes, dark, fathomless, were fixed on her as though she were the only thing anchoring him to the world. "You were brave," he said quietly. "Too brave," her lips parted. "I was terrified." "Good," he murmured, stepping toward her. "Fear keeps you alive." The space between them thinned until she could feel the heat radiating from his body, his presence overwhelming. Her pulse fluttered wildly, and she had to force herself not to step back. Not because she wanted distance, but because she wanted the opposite far too much. "Aris," she whispered, his name trembling on her tongue. He should have kept away. He told himself this with every breath, but being near her was like standing at the edge of a storm, knowing it would swallow him whole and no longer caring. "You don't understand," he said, his voice raw. "I've faced enemies that would bring kingdoms to their knees. I've seen death, betrayal, ruin, but nothing has ever undone me the way you do." Her throat tightened. She searched his face, finding no jest, no manipulation, only stark truth. "Why me?" she whispered. He exhaled, shaking his head faintly, as though he didn't understand it himself. "Because from the moment I found you in that lifeboat, trembling but unbroken, you silenced everything, the noise, the power, the endless hunger for more. I have ruled oceans and empires, yet standing before you, I am nothing but a man whose world begins and ends with your breath." Isla's chest ached. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not even in the gilded halls of her family's palace, where words were crafted as weapons. There she had always been a piece of strategy, a bargaining chip, a crown waiting to be placed. But to Aris, she was a storm. She was everything. Her hands trembled as she looked down, fighting the dangerous swell of warmth inside her. "You shouldn't say things like that," she whispered. "Not to me." "Why not?" "Because I might start believing them." The silence that followed was heavy, charged. The only sound was the lap of waves against the hull, the slow, steady thunder of her heartbeat. Aris stepped closer, and now there was barely a breath of space between them. She could feel the heat of him, the pull of his presence like gravity itself. "You should believe them," he said, his voice low and unwavering, "because they are the only truth I know." Her breath hitched, and she turned away, unable to hold the weight of his gaze. She gripped the railing, staring out at the black stretch of sea. "I left everything behind," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My family, my title, the future they planned for me. I thought it would be freedom, but I've never felt more lost." Eris's hand came to rest lightly on the railing beside hers, so close that his fingers brushed her own. "You are not lost," he said. "You are exactly where you were meant to be." Her throat closed. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong. But instead, her eyes burned with tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed. For the first time, she let the words spill out. "They wanted me to marry him," she said bitterly, "a man who saw me as nothing but an ornament for his ambition. He smiled in public, whispered lies in private, and I was supposed to stand there, smiling back, while he hollowed me out piece by piece. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't—" Her voice cracked, and she pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady herself. Eris's presence loomed closer, not suffocating, but anchoring, steady, like the very ocean itself. "You did the only thing you could," he said quietly. "You chose yourself." "I chose to run," she whispered. "Like a coward?" "No," he said fiercely, his voice cutting through her despair. "Like a survivor. Do you know how many people would have bowed to their chains and called it duty? You didn't. You fought for your life with nothing but your will and the sea at your back. That is not cowardice. That is strength." She turned then, meeting his gaze through the blur of tears. His expression was carved from stone, yet his eyes burned with something unyielding, something that terrified her more than anything else. Devotion. Neither of them spoke after that. They stood side by side at the railing, the silence between them no longer empty but filled with unspoken truths. Isla felt it, his nearness like a constant hum beneath her skin. The way her body ached with awareness of him, she should have pulled away. Instead, she leaned just slightly closer, enough that their shoulders brushed. It was the smallest of touches, but it sent her pulse racing. Eris didn't move, didn't speak, but his hand, bandaged and strong, shifted until his little finger grazed hers on the railing. Barely there, barely anything at all. And yet it was everything. Hours passed, the night deepening around them. They didn't move, didn't need words. The confession had already been spoken, though not in sentences, only in the silence they shared, in the breaths that mingled, in the aching pull of two hearts surrendering to something far greater than reason. When at last Isla turned to leave, her body trembling with exhaustion, she glanced back at him. Eris remained at the railing, his gaze on the horizon, but she saw the faintest curve of his lips, the ghost of something softer than she had ever seen from him. And in that moment, she knew he wasn't her captor, he wasn't her savior. He was the storm she had tried to flee, and the harbor she could no longer imagine living without. She had escaped one prison, only to find herself willingly captive to the storm in Eris Landertz's eyes. The dawn was a pale wash of gold over the horizon, the ocean catching light as though fire had been scattered across its surface. The yacht cut smoothly through the waves, but inside Isla's chest there was no smoothness, no peace. The silence of the night before had lingered with her, heavier than words, deeper than any confession spoken aloud. She had felt it in the way Eris's presence filled the air, in the way his hand had brushed hers on the railing, in the way her heart had leapt at the smallest shift of his breath. She had fled her kingdom seeking freedom. Yet here, on this yacht, her freedom was tangled with something else, something far more dangerous than duty. It was him. By mid-morning, the peace shattered. Eris had gathered his advisors in the yacht's private chamber, their voices low, urgent. Isla lingered just outside the doorway, half hidden, the weight of their words pressing against her like iron. "The world is calling this an abduction," one of them said grimly. "The media has been flooded with the story. Her family has issued statements. They demand her return," another voice cut in. "Her fiancé is rallying the press, accusing you, Iris. He paints you as a pirate, a criminal, the kidnapper of a princess. He's swaying public opinion." A third voice, sharper. "You cannot hold her here without consequence." This will escalate into war, if not of armies, then of reputations. Already investors are pulling back. The seas may be yours, but kingdoms will strike where it hurts most. Your empire. Silence fell. Isla's breath caught as she realized all eyes had turned to Eris. She couldn't see his face from her vantage point, but she could feel his presence even now, his silence taut like a drawn bow. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, controlled, but beneath it thrummed something raw. She stays until she chooses otherwise. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Until she chooses otherwise. Not until he let her go. Not until her family demanded it. Until she chose. She didn't know why the words shook her so deeply. Perhaps because they gave her something she had never truly been offered before. Choice. That evening, Isla stood on the deck, the sky painted in streaks of pink and violet. The wind tangled in her hair, but she didn't move to tame it. Her thoughts swirled like the sea beneath her feet. A choice. Her family's expectations pressed down on her like chains. Return, marry, bow to duty. Smile for the cameras, be the jewel on a corrupt man's crown. But then there was Eris, a man who had plucked her from the sea, not with cruelty, but with wonder. A man whose every glance at her stripped him bare, leaving him trembling with a devotion he didn't know how to hide. A man who had fought, bled, and nearly died to keep her safe. Not because of what she was, but because of who she was. And the truth was, she didn't want to leave him. That realization was a storm all its own. He found her standing there, silhouetted against the dying light. For a moment he said nothing, only watched her, his throat tight, his chest heavy with the ache that had become constant since the moment he first saw her. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. Isla, she turned, and the soft gold of the sunset caught in her eyes, turning them into molten fire. They're demanding you back, he said. The words felt like shards on his tongue. Your family, the press, the world, her hands clenched at her sides. And what do you want? The question undid him. He wanted to roar his answer, to sweep her into his arms and never let her go. But instead, he forced the words out with a steadiness that betrayed the storm raging in him. What I want doesn't matter. Yes, it does, she pressed, stepping closer. His jaw tightened, his control frayed. What I want, he said hoarsely, is you. Always you. But love is not chains. I will not keep you here if your heart calls you elsewhere. Her breath stuttered, her eyes burning. You would let me go? The words nearly killed him. If it means your freedom, yes. For the longest moment, neither moved. The waves lapped against the hull, the sky darkened to indigo, and the air between them thickened with everything unspoken. Isla's throat ached. She had been given many things in her life, wealth, luxury, power, but never this. Never the freedom to choose, not without consequence, not without manipulation. Her family demanded obedience. Her fiancé demanded possession. But Eris demanded nothing. He only offered himself, his heart laid bare, his soul trembling with the hope he could not voice. And it undid her. You don't understand, she whispered, her voice breaking. If I return, I'll lose myself. I'll be caged again, paraded like an ornament, forced into a life I cannot bear. But if I stay, her words faltered, her chest heaving. If you stay, Eris said, stepping closer, his eyes searing into hers, I will give you nothing but truth. No masks, no cages, only the sea and me. Flawed, unworthy, but yours. Her tears spilled, catching the last light of the sun. She should have been afraid of such intensity, of the way his words wrapped around her like a vow stronger than iron. But instead, for the first time in her life, she felt safe. Her hand lifted, hesitant, trembling, and brushed against his bandaged one. The touch was feather-light, but it made his breath hitch, his throat run dry, his entire body tense with the force of it. Eris, she whispered, his name breaking from her lips like a prayer. I don't want crowns. I don't want thrones. I don't want duty that feels like shackles. Her voice cracked. I want the man who made the sea feel like home. His control shattered. His chest heaved as he fought the surge of emotion that threatened to drown him, but even then, he didn't touch her. He stood there, trembling, letting her choose. Always letting her choose. When at last she stepped forward, closing the distance between them, pressing her forehead lightly to his chest, it was not a declaration of surrender but of freedom. Her heart was her own at last, and it beat for him. That night, Eris stood long after she had gone below deck, staring out at the horizon with damp lashes and a heart that throbbed with both wonder and terror. He had braced himself to lose her. He had told himself she would walk away. But she hadn't. She had walked back. He braced for the shattering of his heart, never imagining she would walk back into his arms instead. The sun rose in blazing gold, spilling fire across the endless ocean. The yacht glided steadily over calm waters, its deck awash in light, its sails cutting clean against the sky. To the world, it was just another morning at sea, but to Aris Landers, it was the beginning of something he had never dared believe possible. For Isla had chosen him. She had spoken the words softly, trembling, but with a conviction that had seared itself into his heart. She had not been forced, not manipulated, not trapped. She had chosen him over crowns, over kingdoms, over duty. And now every breath he drew felt different. The air tasted sharper, sweeter. The world itself seemed transformed, as though her choice had remade it into something new. But with choice came consequence. And Eris knew they could not remain hidden at sea forever. News traveled quickly, carried by satellites and screens, louder than waves, sharper than steel. Isla's disappearance had already caused a storm, but her return, if told truthfully, could topple empires. Her fiancé, furious and desperate, had spun tales of villainy, painting Eris as a pirate who had stolen her against her will. The media consumed it ravenous. Her family had pleaded for her safe return, their voices polished with sorrow but sharpened by politics. But Isla was not helpless. Not anymore. She stood at the edge of the deck now, her hair loose in the morning wind, her gaze steady on the horizon. For the first time in her life, she was not a pawn in someone else's game. She was the one holding the board. Eris approached her quietly, his presence as commanding as the sea itself. She turned, and when her eyes found his chest tightened with the same force it had from the very first moment. "We cannot run forever," she said, her voice calm but sure. "No," he agreed, though every part of him wanted to keep her out here on the waves, hidden away from the claws of the world. "But when we face them, it will be on your terms. No crown, no fiancé, no family can decide for you. Only you." Her throat tightened, her hand curling into the railing. "And if I choose you still?" His breath caught. "Then I will fight the world to keep you." Her lips trembled, her eyes brightening with the burn of tears she refused to let fall. "I don't want you to fight the world. I want us to face it together." And with those words, something in him broke wide open, spilling warmth into every corner of his chest. The opportunity came sooner than either of them expected. A press conference. Cameras. A world waiting to see the missing princess restored. The villain exposed, the order of crowns and nations rebalanced. But Isla refused the script they tried to write for her. With Aris at her side, not touching, never touching, though his presence seared her like fire, she stepped forward into the light. Her voice was steady, unflinching, as she spoke truths no one had expected. She told them of her escape, of the life she had been forced into, of the lies her fiancé had wrapped in gold and silk. She exposed his corruption piece by piece, every forged account, every deceitful transaction. She stripped his empire bare, leaving him trembling under the glare of the world's scrutiny. And then, when all eyes were on her, she told them the final truth. "That man did not steal me," she said, her voice carrying over the cameras, into the world. "I chose to leave. And when the sea brought me to Aris Landers, it did not deliver me to a captor. It delivered me to the first man who ever looked at me and saw not a crown, not a pawn, not a possession, only me." Her words spread like fire. The narrative shifted, the lies unraveling before the weight of her conviction. The fiancé's mask fell, his empire crumbling, his ambition rotting in full view of the world. And through it all, Eris stood behind her, silent but unyielding, his gaze never leaving her, his heart beating with a ferocity that no ocean could rival. When it was over, when the cameras dimmed and the storm of questions dissolved into the chaos of headlines, Isla returned to the yacht with him. She walked the deck barefoot, the sea wind catching her laughter, the sound of it light, unguarded, like sunlight breaking through a storm. Eris followed, his chest aching with something he had no name for. He had prepared himself to lose her 100 times. He had braced for it, willed himself to face it with dignity, but she had not left. She had chosen. And now, in the quiet, in the peace, he could no longer contain what swelled inside him. He found her standing at the bow, looking out at the horizon. His footsteps slowed, his throat dry, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. "Isla," he said, his voice unsteady for the first time in years. She turned, smiling faintly. "Yes?" He swallowed, the weight of everything he felt pressing against him, threatening to shatter his composure. This man who had conquered oceans, who had ruled empires, who had bent men to his will, now trembled like a boy in the face of her gaze. "I have nothing to offer you but myself," he said, his voice raw. "Not a crown, not a throne, only the sea and a man who is wholly, irrevocably yours." Her breath caught, her eyes widening. He lowered himself, not in grand ceremony but in quiet reverence. On one knee before her, the ocean spread wide behind him, his heart laid bare. "This time," he whispered, "it is your choice. Will you stay?" For a moment, the world held its breath. Then Isla's laughter broke, soft and trembling, rich with joy that shone brighter than the sun. She sank down before him, her hands trembling as they found his. "I was never leaving," she said, her voice thick with tears. "Not from the moment you found me. And though no kiss sealed it, though no vow was written in stone, the promise hung in the air like sacred truth. They wed aboard his yacht, the horizon their chapel, the sea their witness. There were no gilded arches, no jeweled crowns, no politics masquerading as blessings, only laughter, only devotion, only the wild, breathtaking sweetness of a love that had survived every storm. Isla's gown was simple, white as the foam that crested the waves. Her hair caught the sunlight like a crown spun from fire itself. Eris wore no armor, no regalia, only the quiet strength of a man who had finally surrendered not to power, but to love. When she spoke her vows, her voice trembled. "You stole me from the world I thought I belonged to, but the truth is it was never mine. You are my world now, my freedom, my anchor, my horizon." And when he spoke his throat ached, his voice unsteady, his chest full to breaking. "I had conquered everything, but nothing mattered until you. I was a king of oceans, but you made me a man. And I will spend every day of my life proving worthy of the gift you've given me, your heart." The crew cheered. The sea roared its applause, and the yacht sailed forward, carrying them into forever. As twilight fell, Isla leaned against him at the railing, her laughter mingling with the sigh of the waves. Eris looked down at her, his chest aching with a love so fierce it frightened him still. Even now, he had found her by accident. But she had become his only destiny. He had found her by accident, but she became the only destiny he would ever believe in.